Good morning. What a wonderful turnout for a product I'm very, very excited about. I'm so pleased to see so many people here early on a Wednesday morning for what I think is probably one of the more exciting things that's happened in my particular area for some time. My name's Andrew Coates. I'm a developer evangelist here at Microsoft, and I was just counting the other day, this is my 22nd Tech Ed. If you count, the ones I've been to around the world. So I'm a big fan of this event. I'm a big fan of the sort of stuff you can do here around learning, connecting, exploring, evolving, all those cool things that we talk about. One of the things that I'm really excited about is the opportunity to show off some neat new technology. But before I do that, I have a short housekeeping thing. Well, not housekeeping, actually a very important housekeeping thing that I want to do. There are three people I want to call up here who've been instrumental in community LightSwitch stuff from very early on. So Glenn Wilson, where are you? Can you come up here, please, mate? Brian Madsen, are you in the room? Not yet. Brian's coming, I think. And Jan Duran. So I have a T-shirt for you. Thank you, sir. Glenn's doing a heap of great work around the Silverlight stuff that you might see in the second session. And he'll be around on the stands and so on as well. If you've got questions about real life LightSwitch stuff, then Glenn's a great person to talk to. And when Brian and Jan come in, if they do, I'll try and introduce you to them as well, because it's really important to understand who's doing this cool stuff. Thanks, mate. Appreciate it. Big round of applause for Glenn, by the way, folks. Thanks. So, let's hook straight into this. I guess the other couple of housekeeping things, if you're tweeting about this, don't forget to use AU TechEd and Dev201 in your Twitter stream. I'll be looking at it later, and I'll find out who you are if you've tweeted the wrong things. And my contact details are there as well. I'll put them up again at the end. So, who's played with LightSwitch before? Who's downloaded it at least? Yeah. Who's installed it? Who's built something with it? Deployed something with it? Ish. Okay, interesting. And who's never seen it before? Excellent. That's great. Because this is the intro session. If you'd seen it before, then the intro session might be a little bit introductory. LightSwitch is really all about forms over data, and we talk about this thing being really simple to develop business applications. Yeah, for the desktop and the cloud. Simple business applications, desktop and cloud. Why is that important? Well, I like to think of there being a chasm between, on one side, high-end .NET applications, the really full-on stuff that's built by enterprise IT. Over here, I'm not particularly pointing at you people, but let's just say there's the lower-end applications. There's things like Access and Excel macro applications that are built, and there are lots and lots of those. In the middle, there's a big gap. LightSwitch is designed to fill that gap. Now, whenever you get a new product out of any vendor, particularly Microsoft, but any vendor, the first thing you need to do is ask, who is it aimed at? Who's the target audience? Because obviously they've done a lot of thinking about who this is aimed at. And really, LightSwitch is for what we call end-user developers. If you've not heard of EUDs before, get used to it. I think it's an acronym I just made up, but I'm sure it's going to catch on. End-user developers are the people who write those middle and low-end applications. They're not end users. They're not people who just use computers. They're generally tech-savvy. They're the sort of person who tinkers in their spare time. And they're either somebody like the resident IT guy in the marketing department, or maybe someone who kind of works for themselves, a doctor or someone like that, who tends to just whip up an application to get the job done. They tend to be the people who use IT as a tool rather than a passion. Now, I don't know whether LightSwitch is going to change that, but certainly it's going to certainly those people exist. Now, end-user developers are really important. There are lots and lots and lots of them. Has anyone been in the situation where they have inherited an application from an end-user developer into corporate IT? Tell me how that went. Was that I see a lot of this. Yeah, not a lot of fun. Now, the reason for that is because these end-user developers are simply getting their job done as quickly as they possibly can. They're using the tools that are available for them to do whatever they need to do. However, they've not thought about what's going to happen next. Yeah? The common scenario is, the marketing department come to the IT department and say, we're running a campaign and we want to capture this additional information about the people we're running the campaign for, and we're going to use it to generate a whole bunch of marketing things. And the IT department goes, sure, that's what we do, no problem. Here's our requirements documentation collection manual. And we'll come back in 6.5 weeks and we'll do our first requirements gathering meeting. And the marketing department look at them and scans and say, you know, you don't understand. This campaign's going live in 2 weeks and it's lasting for a week and a half. It's not going to work. So what happens is the marketing department goes back and they talk to the guy who unpacks the PCs in the marketing department, who whips up an Access application, which is great, and it runs the campaign beautifully and everyone's happy. And in fact, the campaign tends to go on a little bit longer and there's more information that's coming out of this and everyone decides this is a really important application and the marketing department are really happy with the application and the guy who unpacks the PCs goes and gets a different job, and a year later, the PC on which this application was running, sitting under someone's desk, has a power supply or a hard disk failure and balks, and the marketing department come to the IT department and say, because that's what they do in marketing, right? Yeah. And they say, you know, can you fix it, can you fix it? The IT department look at them and laugh and say, no, not possible. And everyone's unhappy with everybody else. The thing that LightSwitch is going to do is solve that problem. Well, I'm going to put my little, use a little asterisk there. It may also solve world hunger, but, you know, again with the asterisk. That it is going to make a big, big difference to that problem, because as you'll see as we go through this session, the thing that LightSwitch does is provide you at the front end with a very usable end user developer tool, very, very usable. And at the back end, it provides you with a strong, robust architecture that gives you as an IT person every confidence that you can bring it in-house and maintain it and deploy it and distribute it. Very, very simply. So what I like to say is we've kind of bridged that gap between the low-end app up here and the really high-end expensive app over here. Now, of course, when you're bridging a gap, and I heard Jay Smelter say this the other day, when you're bridging a gap, you need to make sure you overlap a bit on each side, because otherwise you just leave two gaps. So what you'll see with LightSwitch is that you'll see some things that look very much like Visual Studio. And you'll see some things that look very much like our other end-user tools, because there is some crossover. But what you'll see in the middle is some very, very neat stuff that's going to make a big difference to you as IT pros. As professional IT people. Can I have a quick show of hands who works as a developer? Yeah? Who manages developers? Who manages managers of developers? Okay. And who is, if you'd like, it's not someone who has development in their title or in the management chain. Not very many. So it's very interesting that particularly professional IT developers are interested in this product. And that's also very, very cool. So end user developers want this smooth on-ramp for development. They want it to be really easy to get into whatever they're doing. They want to have a whole bunch of stuff built in for them. We'll look at that as we go through, doing things that they don't want to have to do over and over again. And they want it to be really easy and flexible to deploy. And we'll talk about that later on too. The thing is that professional developers are also going to be excited about LightSwitch for two reasons. One is you can hand off this product to the end user developer and say, go ahead, build your application. The second thing is you can provide a whole lot of smarts that your business can do to the end user developer through an extension, the extensibility capabilities. And we'll talk a lot about those in the next session, which is on tomorrow afternoon. But the extensibility story is very, very strong in LightSwitch. And there are a whole lot of places you can hook into LightSwitch to give your end user developers a very, very good experience. So professional developers should be very excited about this product as well. I know I am. It's only a small room, I can share this. Lots of you may not know this, but my native language is actually Visual Fox Pro. Any other Fox developers in here? One or two? Yes, there we go. Excellent. Yeah, well, guys, come and talk to me later. We can share war stories about all things Fox. It's amazing how many places you go into, and if you go around the other side of the point of sale terminal, you'll still see a Fox DOS application running the point of sale. But one of the things I loved about Fox Pro was how close you were to the data, how easy it was to very quickly put together an application that did everything you want to do and scaled quite nicely. When that went away, I was a bit disappointed because, you know, we didn't really have anything in the meantime. You could go and do VB or C# things in .NET, or you could go into Access things, but there wasn't anything in the middle. And I really think that the LightSwitch kind of fills that gap for the sort of things that I'm going to do as a professional developer lots of the time. We did some research and found that about 80% of new applications in enterprise were a standard forms over data application, where you had a bunch of tables and a bunch of forms over those data tables. Yeah? And they all had to have the same things in the back end. They had to have a way of displaying the forms and the data. They had to have a way of doing things like dirty checking. They had to have a way of things of coordinating between screens and those sorts of things. So we built that into the system. So when you start with a LightSwitch application, whether you're a professional developer or an end user developer, the first thing you'll see is the request to describe your data. And we'll have a look at that in a minute, what it looks like. And then you get the requirement to show the data on the screens. Those two fundamental things are the only things you have to do to create a LightSwitch application. There's a bunch more stuff you can do that we'll talk about later on, but those first two things, describing your data and creating your screens for your common tasks, are the only two things you have to do. So let's look at how easy that is to do. Okay, so I've got Visual Studio up here. I happen to have Visual Studio Ultimate. Can we actually see all that screen? Not really. That's near enough. I happen to have Visual Studio Ultimate. Now, Visual Studio LightSwitch doesn't require Visual Studio Ultimate, doesn't require Visual Studio anything. Okay, if you buy Visual Studio LightSwitch on its own or download the trial and you don't have any version of Visual Studio installed on your machine, you will get the Visual Studio shell and just the LightSwitch bits. If you do have Visual Studio Professional or above installed on your machine, then you'll get it installed as a bunch of extra templates, like all the other sort of plugin stuff we do, like the Azure Toolkit and all those other kinds of things, and the MVC3, all that sort of thing. So I happen to have Ultimate up here because later on in the demonstration tomorrow, I'm going to show you how to build some extensions and so on, and for that you do need Professional or above. But for the LightSwitch bits by itself, you just need Visual Studio. So you just need the LightSwitch installed. So I'm going to say File, New Project. And what we'll see here is your standard sort of New Project dialog. If I, where's the AV guy? If I click off and click back on, am I going to see more of this screen? Let's see. That's better? Cool. File, New Project, and I'm on the LightSwitch node. Now, I happen to have a lot of things available on this LightSwitch node because not only do I have LightSwitch installed, but I've downloaded a whole lot of additional LightSwitch content which is available for free, which are called starter kits. Now, the starter kits give you, I think there are currently 5 of them, give you a starter application that gets you going straight away into job tracking or expense tracking or what else have we got there? Customer service or issue tracking. There's a whole bunch of different things. And so we give you a whole lot of best practices guidance and a setup to get going. So we've found, say, 5 common scenarios and got you started with stuff. You don't have to do that, and we won't in this particular case. I'm just going to create a standard LightSwitch application. Now, you want a VB application or a C# application? Ready? VB? C#. Okay. One of the things you'll find about the LightSwitch doco is that lots and lots of it's in VB. They've made a big effort to also do C# stuff, but there's 2 reasons for that. One is they reckon the end user developer is more likely to be a VB developer, and so they've concentrated a lot on getting sample code out in the language that makes sense. The next one is that the person who's writing lots of the sample code, Beth Massey, is a huge VB bigot. Tell her I said that. but she's been enlisting other people to do some C# translation for her. Anyway, we're going to create a C# visual LightSwitch application. I'm going to call it Vision Clinic. And we'll call it AU because that's where we are. And basically what I'm going to create is a simple application for managing a clinic that does, an optometrist clinic. Yeah, this common sort of thing you might want to be able to do. So that's all I really need to do there. I'll just say OK, and off it'll go. Now, it creates the application for me. In fact, we might even do this. How's that? Creates the application for me. The project for me. And remember I said that we want you to start with data? Could we make it much clearer than that? Yeah? This is what you have to do, start with data. Now, the data we're going to start with can come from a number of different places, and one of the really cool things about LightSwitch is that it understands a number of different data sources. By the way, there's Brian Madsen up the back, folks. Just wave, Brian. I called you out before. Another one of our community people, LightSwitch people, so if you've got LightSwitch questions, wave again. Say hi, Brian. Yeah, very good. Yeah, come and see me for a shirt later. One of the cool things about LightSwitch is that data is understood from a number of different places, and it gets federated from a number of different places. I'll show you a little bit about this later on, but when you say where do my data come from, you've got a number of different options. So let's starting with data. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect to an external data source. So it happens that I happen to have the beginnings of my data elsewhere, somewhere in the enterprise, on a SQL server in this particular case. It doesn't have to be, as you can see, it could be in all sorts of other places too. And this dialog lots of you will have seen before. And let's get the Contoso. Have anyone heard of the Contoso company? A very large multinational company. Yeah, yeah. They're doing prescriptions now as well. And I'll just test that connection. Lovely. And click OK. And the first thing it'll do is go off and find out what tables are in this database. Now, this is actually a fairly simple database in this particular case. It's only got 2 tables, so I'll take them both. And I'll click Finish. Now, what I'll get now is what's called the Entity Designer. And it gives me a representation of what's happening inside the database, what's happening inside my data. It's got both the tables there. It's discovered automatically the relationship between the two of them, and it's represented that. And it's shown me all the product types. Sorry, all the data types. Now, I'm going to make a couple of little changes. The first thing is that by default, I don't want the product rebate ID being shown in my screens. So I'll turn that off. And I've turned that off. I've modeled that at the data level. The cool thing about doing all this modeling at the data level is all respected at the screen level. It doesn't matter how you get to that screen level. So we do a lot of this stuff at the data level, data description level. So I'll turn off the product rebate ID. And I'll also change this rebate amount type from decimal to a type called money. Now, behind the scenes, it's still getting persisted as a decimal. But we are using what we call a LightSwitch business type to do a whole lot of things, including understanding what the default currency is, how to display it, and all those kinds of things. And that stuff, because it's getting displayed in the data, also gets flowed through to the screens. And we'll see how that works later on. Now, I haven't changed anything in the back end, obviously, and I wouldn't be allowed to as an end user developer. This is enterprise data we're talking about here. I'm not going to be able to change schemas in this tool. That would be bad, I think. All right, so the next thing I want to do is go to the product table. I can just do that by double-clicking on the product table. Notice the relationship kind of just inverts. Again, I don't want the product ID to be displayed by default. I do want the recommended retail price to be a money thing. The image, I want it to be an image rather than a binary. Even though it's being stored as a var binary, I want it to be displayed when it comes on the screen as an image. Yeah? And so LightSwitch is going to handle all that stuff for me. That'll do. And then what I'm going to do now, although I've got the product details from somewhere else, I also need to, in my clinic, capture information about patients. Now, I don't have a table for that anywhere else. So I'm going to create one. I'm going to create a local table. Now, I'm going to add a table. I'm going to call the table patient. Now, what's happening here behind the scenes? Well, to the end user, it doesn't matter. It's just a table. Just another way of storing data. But to you and me as a professional developer, we need to know that actually what's happening is it's creating an MDF file that SQL Express is going to attach to for local storage, and it's going to be very simple to move that what we call the local data store into a proper enterprise SQL database somewhere, because it is just SQL Server. Yeah, it's just SQL Express in the back end. So to the end user, it's all simple, and to us, we know it's scalable and robust, which is kind of a good thing. So the patient ID, we'll uncheck that display by default as well. We don't really want that. But we do want a last name, which is a string, first name, which we won't make required. Let's call it a social security number, for want of a better term. Again, not required. Maybe the gender, which is a string. Now, which is required. One of the things I want to do with gender is only give people a choice of 2, or maybe 3, depending on where we live. So I can do that by adding this thing called a choice list. There's 2 things I want to do. Firstly, I want to make this a maximum length of 1. And then in the choice list, I want to say M which will display male, and F, which will display female. Now, at the back end, all that's being stored is the single character, M or F. But at the front end, we've now put the smarts in to make this a restricted set of values that can go in there, and also enough smarts that when we display a drop-down box, it takes the display value and shows the display value and binds the value itself in the back end. Yep. Let's go phone. So the question is, it's a relationship. You mean, but it's a relation. Okay, so the relationship between the male and F is stored at the data definition layer. There's a data model that gets stored as part of this, and that's where that's stored. Phone number, and that's of type phone number. Now, another one of our data types, and this is a bit of an extended data type, because I've got a whole lot of different things I can do in here. I've got phone number formats, and it pops up this dialog. It says, what formats can the phone number be in? And let's add a new format for Australia, which is CC A NNNN, which is our canonical format here in Australia, and I'll move that up to the top. Save. So that information is now stored there as well. So it comes out of the box with a whole bunch of formats that happen automatically. The validation is, we'll check that it's in one of those now 9 different formats, automatically, and I've had the ability to add things that make sense for my particular location. So that's popped in there as well. Yep. So do the same with email address, which is type email address, another one of those data types. Email address has got some interesting things like default domain. I can put Microsoft.com as the default domain. If I put nothing else in there other than my alias, then it'll automatically fill that in. I'm not going to do that in this case because I want to show you some other cool stuff. What else have we got there? We've got email address and then some address things. And I'm actually going to use these later on, so it may look like I'm adding things kind of for the sake of it, but I'm not. Let's just turn these requireds off as well. Address 1, address 2. And I know I could denormalize and put addresses in a separate table and all that kind of thing. I'm not going to in this particular case. City, state, postal code, and country. Right. No, I'm not putting spaces in the names of the. So good question. I'm not putting spaces in the names of the actual fields. What you'll find is when I go over to postal code, LightSwitch is smart enough to change the display name here to have a space in it. And so all that stuff is taken care of because I've camel cased it. LightSwitch is smart enough to pick up camel casing and do all those kinds of things. It also does it for underscores and a bunch of other things as well. But you don't want to put spaces in there because they're actually object properties. And spaces in object properties are bad. In fact, if I try and put a space, LightSwitch is smart enough to tell me that I'm an idiot, I think. All right. Next thing I want to do is add another table for a prescription. And a prescription, let's call it this. I don't want this displayed by default. The prescription has got prescription date, which is of date type, and a notes field, which is of a string type. And let's make the prescription required, and the notes not required. The date required, not required. Okay. Now I want to actually, a patient can have many prescriptions, so I can add a relationship. So we go from prescription to patient. See how I'm kind of being walked through the process of describing my data? First thing I had to do was describe data, now I'm being walked through that process. This is an interesting dialogue because it gives you a lot of options, lots of which are not actually applicable. It forbids them. So if I try and go a many-to-many relationship, thank you for playing. If I try and have a one-to-one relationship, thank you for playing. If I can have many-to-one or many, and I can say whether things are required or not, but that's about it at this stage in V1. Now, there are ways to get around these things. I would suggest that as end-user developers, this is probably what they want to be able to do most of the time. And so we'll leave it like that. Okay, so we've got a relationship now. And that relationship shows up in the designer as well. Now, prescriptions can also have a number of products in their prescription, which makes sense, doesn't it? So if you have a prescription, it might not just release it. So we're going to add another relationship to prescription to product. And there's a couple of things to note here. Firstly, the product table is not in our local data store. So now we're setting relationships between something we've done locally and something that's happening externally. So we're describing a relationship in the model that may not actually physically exist anywhere else. And the cool thing about this is, to the end user developer, they don't care. LightSwitch handles all that stuff behind the scenes. It knows to go and set foreign keys in there. So you'll notice that down the bottom it's added an auto-generated product ID into the product into the patient table. Sorry, into the prescription table. Yeah, because now it's done a whole lot of stuff around foreign. It understands there's a foreign key and away it goes. So it's going to manage that relationship for us automatically. Okay, and click OK. And then I'm going to turn off this display by default as well, because I don't want that seen either. Right. A couple more little things I want to show you. The first one is, he said, going off to there. All right. The first one is that what we really want to be able to do is display what we call a summary property for each table. If we were to show a list of things in a table, what is the one field that we want to represent any row in that table? LightSwitch makes a guess every time you create a new table. And it guesses that the first string field it comes across is going to be a summary field. Sometimes that's a good guess, sometimes not so much. So, for example, in the description thing here, the summary property in this particular prescription is actually the notes. Probably not what we're after. What we really want the summary property to be is when was the prescription delivered or given. So now we've changed the summary property to be a date. Although it's guessed the string field, in fact we want the date to be the summary property, because that makes a bunch of sense. When was this prescription filled? And if you had a list, that's what you want to be able to sort by for prescriptions. So that's easy. And that's in the product field, let's do the same thing. Let's go into products. The summary property in products is the product name. So that makes sense. That's our first our string field. In the product rebate, the summary property is the product rebate ID, because there aren't any string fields in here. We don't want the product rebate ID to be it. What we really want the summary property to be is the rebate start date. So what we've done here is, notice that the product stuff is not something we control, but we have described additional information around that data. So that's really easy to do, and we'll see how that flows through into the screens in a little bit. All right. Now the patient table, its summary property makes sense. It's the last name, but really I want the whole name to be the summary property. The problem is summary properties are a single property only, and I need a way of getting the whole name displayed as the summary property. So I'm going to add what I call a computed property, and the computed property is going to be full name, and I get to quickly edit the method that says how to return the full name. So it's a pretty simple method, right? So it's just result equals string, dot format, and I don't know, let's do 0, 1. And then you have this dot last name, this dot first name. And now this summary property gets computed whenever it's needed. Doesn't ever get stored anywhere. It's simply a computation. But the method for computing it is stored as part of the model. And now whenever I need that computed property, that gets called and gets returned to me. So I can save that. And I'll go back here to my designer, and I'll say that the patient summary property is now the full name. And that's what will get listed in a list, yeah, and sorted and all those sort of things for me automatically. Yeah? So you're starting to see some of the power that's coming across here, is that we just described what our data looked like in tables, and now we can do a little bit more manipulation, some neat things that are going on there. All right. I can do some other stuff around things like validation. I could validate the SSN to make sure that it was in the right format, just using a regex, for example, and all of that stuff can happen automatically. I'll show you in the next session some validation stuff that goes on in there. Although let's do some quick validation of at least the dates in the rebates table. So, product rebates table. Remember, I don't own this. I don't own the table itself, but what I can do is I can do some custom validation. And I can say that if now it's this dot rebate end. Oops. If this rebate end is less than this dot rebate start, okay, so now we've got a problem, right? The rebate end date is before the rebate start date. We'll need to tell people about that. So we say results dot add property error. Now, this is a really interesting pattern. When LightSwitch does validation, it says, how do I go about telling the user there's a problem? I want to find out as many problems as I can straight away and cascade it to the user. And what's more, I want to be able to find these problems not just at the client level, but also at the middle tier and at the back end, because that's a proper programming practice, right? You don't want to just capture validation problems at the client level because someone will find a way around it. You don't want to just capture problems at the middle or back end layer because customers get very, very frustrated when they hit submit and it comes back and boom, everything's bad. You want to be able to validate in both places, but you only want to write it once. So behind the scenes what's happening is this is generating a class that lives in what we call a common folder. And it gets compiled into both the client project and the server project, which is happening behind the scenes. Yeah? It's very, very cool stuff. So the pattern is that I add an error, a property error, for every validation error that happens. And all the validation bits get called. I add a property error, and when all the validation bits have been called, LightSwitch inspects that collection of property errors, and if its count is greater than 0, then it displays them and tells you can't save stuff. If its count is 0, everything's good. So it's quite a nice pattern from that point of view. So I'm going to add a property error. Date's wrong. Save me typing. But I could be much more descriptive there, of course. But I've added the property error with a bit of description in there. Yep. I can do the same thing with the rebate end. Control C. V. I just used the the VB inheritance method there. But you can see what I've done there is I've now validated against both the end date and the start date. Yeah? And both of them are interrelated. And because I have access to the entire data workspace at all the times through the validation, I've got access to whatever the current values are of all of the properties of this entity. And I can compare them against each other even when I'm validating a single field. I can also validate, by the way, against the entire, I get a validation call for the entire entity as well. So even if individual fields are okay, there may be some conflict between the entire, between the sum of all the fields, if you like. Maybe you've specified neither age nor birth date, and you need to specify one of those. And either one can be blank, but one of them has to be filled in. So now you're doing validation at the entity level rather than at the property level. And you can certainly do that as well. It's very straightforward to do. There's a whole lot of places we can write hooks here, by the way. If I go back, I'll save this. If I go back into here and look at the product rebate table, I'll drop this down because I've just run out of real estate. But I get a write code button. And there's lots and lots of different places I can hook into. When things are created, when they're updated, when they're deleted, before I create them, before I update them, before I delete them, whether people can actually get to things, like a whole lot of access control, things that we'll talk about a bit later on. There's a really, really, really extensible model behind this, behind the scenes here. So this is definitely worth exploring as a professional developer as well as an end user developer. All right. So the next thing I really want to quickly do is create a screen, because remember what we said, we had to describe our data and then create a screen. So let's do that. I'm going to click the screen button. This dialog that you see here is, there are two things to say about it. The first one is that it's very extensible. The list of screens you see, list of screen types you see there on the left are simply the ones that ship out of the box. This is one of LightSwitch's many, many extension points. You can add more screens in here. The second thing to say is that we've done a lot of research about what the common screen types are that people put in this kind of application. Yeah? You need to be able to display the details of a row, the detail screen. You need to be able to display a grid of rows that might be editable. That's our editable grid screen. There is a list and detail screen where you have a list of rows and then the details about that particular row. You've all seen this kind of stuff before, right? This is add new data and then search. Those five things are very, very common, and they're very straightforward to develop as a LightSwitch developer. What we want to do is be able to add a new patient to start off with. So let's create a new data screen for patients. And because LightSwitch knows that the patient table has a child table called prescriptions, it gives us the option here to also include the prescriptions in this new patient table. We're not going to do that in this case. I'll show you some of that later on. But notice that because we've described our data already, LightSwitch is smart enough to make some very, very sensible suggestions about what we might want to do as part of the process. All right. Okay. And here's our screen designer. Now, is anyone surprised that this is the screen designer? Yeah, a few people. Not a lot of WYSIWYG going on here, right? This is quite deliberate. There's two things to say here. The first one is, this is an MVVM architecture that's happening before your very eyes. And this is the view model. Right? That's what's going on behind the scenes. The end user developer doesn't need to know it's a view model, right? They just need to know that stuff's going to get displayed on the screen. And the cool thing for them is that they can say, these are the sorts of things I want displayed, without having to worry about how they're going to get displayed. So when I press F5, which I'm going to do right now, you'll see that this gets translated quite nicely into an application. What you'll see is that after it builds, is it's going to deploy in this particular case, a Silverlight out-of-browser application that has a whole bunch of Chrome around the outside that we didn't write, a whole bunch of functionality that we didn't write, but that is very, very functional already. So here's our application. Notice a couple of things straight away. We have two required fields in this particular application. Can you see what they are? Yeah, they're in bold automatically. That's because that theme that we've got installed on this machine bolds required fields. If you had a different theme, it might make them a different color or a different size or whatever. But it automatically, as part of the system, we know what the fields are. The next thing is there's a whole lot of other stuff around the outside here. We have, up the top, we have a save button and a refresh button. On the left-hand side, we have a menu of things we can do with things like create a new patient. By the way, notice that added all those spaces, and prettied up the fact that we called the screen create new patient with no spaces, because it was all camel case. It went, oh, I know where to put spaces, it's all good. So I can put things in here, maybe me. But notice down the bottom, by the way, the full name got filled in automatically. This is the summary field that we used. I don't have a social security number. I am, what are the choices? Oh, okay, cool, male. Now my phone number, I can never remember what the canonical format should look like. So that's okay. I'm going to drop this down, and this control happened automatically for me. This is because this is one of the business types that we talked about in LightSwitch. This is the phone type control. Remember I showed you where we could put the phone number formats in the design time experience. The runtime experience means there's a control that ships with it that allows you to do the phone number entry. And this will handle all this for me. So 612, 98702719. And it's formatted it all nicely for me. I haven't put the brackets in there, I haven't put the spaces in there, but because it's one of those formats, it understands it and displays it for me automatically. My email address, acote at microsoft.com. It's validated that for me automatically. This is an invalid email address because I haven't got an @ sign in there. Who's ever written the regex for validating email addresses? How long is it? If you could hold your hand up and you could hold your hand up, that's about how long the regex is. Yeah? Who reckons they've still covered all of the things in the RFC? Not everyone, I'm guessing. It's a deep. We've done that here for you. The end user developer doesn't have to do email address validation. We've done that right here. It's built in. And this is the real power of this this business type that we ship with LightSwitch and allow you to write as well. So in this next session, I'll talk about building business types. And I'll give you an example of an ISBN, for example, that's very simple to do. And you can ship those as part of that to your end users. So I'll change that. I'm all valid. That'll probably do for now. Maybe let's put 1 Epping Road, North Ryde, New South Wales, 2113, Australia. Okay. Now, I'm going to close this. Oh, hang on. I haven't saved changes. Who saw me write the save change code? Yeah, no one, because I didn't have to. It's all built into the system. All of that dirty checking, all of the stuff, all of the rubbish that happens behind the scenes in every single application around contention checking, dirty checking, update, all that stuff is handled for you. And it's built directly into the system. So I'm going to cancel out of there and I will save it. It's very, very neat. Okay. So we'll close that. And I'm going to add another screen. All right. I'm going to give you the ability to edit the details for a user as well. So add another screen. And for patients. And what we're going to do this time is I'm going to include the child table, the patient prescriptions table. And the reason I want to do that is I want to show you how easy it is to create a parent-child relationship screen as well. Very, very straightforward. So, OK, and F5. Let's put Brian in there. Manson, Brian, certainly. That'll do for Brian for now, so I'll press save. And when I press save, what you'll see here is the patient details screen. Now, you didn't notice it last time because it wasn't any different, but last time when I pressed save, I also got a patient details screen. The thing about the patient details screen last time is I hadn't written it. LightSwitch knew that when I pressed save on a new patient, it needed to show me the details of the patient I just saved. So what it did behind the scenes was auto-generated the screen for me based on the new screen that I'd just done, yeah, and showed me the details. What I can do now, though, is because I've added a new details screen, LightSwitch says, oh, OK, you don't want me to auto-generate one. You've done one for yourself, so I'll use the one you've done. Some very, very smart stuff going on behind the scenes there. Now, this gives me a whole lot of other additional stuff too. This prescriptions thing down the bottom, I can add a new prescription right from here. Happened today. The notes were, I don't know, whatever. And the product that Brian needed was something about itch reliever. I don't know what that's about, Brian, but that's... sorry. It's all about eyes, of course. No, nothing. Yeah. And I've added something directly to a different table from the patient detail screen. This master detail stuff all happens for me automatically. Again, I can hit save, or if I don't hit save, it'll get warned that I've got things that haven't been updated. So I'll hit save. A couple of things to note here. Now I've hit save. Notice that in the prescription field, I have got a it's blue down the bottom. That summary field is blue. Now, the reason it's blue is it's now become a hyperlink, and I can go and look at the details of that prescription by clicking on the hyperlink. I get the prescription details form, which of course, remember, I haven't created. It created for me on the fly, but all that stuff is there. All right. So we'll save that, close the app. What I think we really need to do now is be able to find patients again. So we need to create a search screen. So search data, patients. Don't have to call it search patients if I don't want to. I can call it, let's say, find patient. Okay. The other thing I want to do is, I don't want new patient to be the default screen that comes up when I start the application. I really want the patient search screen to be the default screen. So I can do that too. I can edit the screen navigation. I'll just right-click on screens and say edit screen navigation. Find patient goes, I want to put it at the top, but I also want it to be the default. So now that's what's going to come up automatically when I start the application. I don't have to have any of them default, by the way. They can have nothing. But I quite like having the search screen as the default. So let's press F5. And here's my application running in all its glory, loading, running, and bingo. There we have two people. Notice, by the way, the summary field, our full name is, again, a hyperlink. That will take us to a details thing automatically. I can do this, click on this Excel, Export to Excel button. Who saw me write the Export to Excel code? Yeah, didn't have to do it, it's built in. Yeah, very, very cool. Because lots of people want to be able to take a list and put it in Excel, we can do that. It's unidirectional in this particular case, although there is an add-in, Excel import add-in that you can download from the gallery. So that's great. I can type a search in here, Madsen, and it's found that. Cool. Let's clear that and Epping. Now, I'm pressing Epping here. There's no one called Epping, but because by default the search searches across all text fields by default, it's found the fact that I live at 1 Epping Road, North Ryde, and found that for me automatically. So I can turn on and off which fields get sorted, which gets searched on, but by default any text field gets searched on in these search dialog boxes. Very, very cool stuff. Very extensible. Very quite useful. All right. There's all sorts of other stuff you can control there too. You can control which fields get searched on. You can do things like how many records are returned at a time. If I change the look and feel of this particular screen with column resizing, column ordering, column sorting, that gets stored on a per user basis. All that stuff happens automatically. All that persistence happens automatically. All the stuff behind the scenes the drudgery work you have to write has all been done. Now, I'm going to click this link to the full name screen. Maybe I'll click it to me this time. And one of the things that you miss out on by not having a WYSIWYG editor at design time is you miss out on the ability to see what's changing when you make changes to that model view, the view model. So what we've done is we've incorporated a kind of editor here. If you are in debug mode, this button up here that says Design Screen will appear. Now, if I click that button, what I'll get is that a very similar layout to what you saw at design time. But on the right-hand side at the top, I'll actually get a live representation of the data. Yeah? So the stuff that's going on up here is actually live. It's easy to do with Silverlight, right? It's just a scale transform to bring it down to whatever size you want to bring it down to and display it somewhere in the dialog. But I can make those changes and they get persisted back through the debug process back into the model, right from there. It's just going to be easy to see if I do the changes I'm going to make now in the design time. But that capability is right there. So let's go and in the where are we? Yeah, okay. In the patient detail screen, we're going to make a few little changes. Remember the patient detail screen has got the prescription details at the bottom as well. I want to show the image in that list as well. So when we go to under here, I don't want to show the product in there, so I'll delete that. The prescription at this summary control that can go as well. because the date can stay there. I don't necessarily want to be able to go through to the prescription. The product control here, I'm going to make that a image and picture and text control, which is one of the ones that ships out of the box. And that has got a number of sub pieces. So the picture comes from the product image, the title comes from the product name, the subtitle comes from the retail price, and the description comes from the description. So that's pretty cool. Now when I go into the prescriptions, the data grid command bar, I can take out the add and edit buttons, and I can add an add new button. Now this is a slightly different. Instead of an add with a dialog coming up, it just adds a new row into my list. Yep. I can move that up here, and you can see that I'm mucking around with the view model, the way things are going to get displayed. So let's press F5 and see if all that worked. So let's go to Brian, because I know that he has a record in here, and we've got all that stuff available directly in. Yeah, I think it's cool. Who clapped? I thought that was very neat. That is cool. Yep. The edit button went away, by the way. All that sort of stuff just happened. Okay. All right. So I think it's time we just quickly switch back and do some summary bits. What's happened behind the scenes here is we've actually created quite a sophisticated architecture in this LightSwitch application. We've created a client tier, and the client tier was made up of a number of things. We saw some screens, we saw a bunch of methods and controls that interact. What you didn't see behind the scenes is a whole workspace where all the data are corralled and moved around between tiers. And that data workspace is where we were able to do all our validation and so on, yeah, in that space. WCF RIA services are used to go and talk back to the back end and back again. And we've displayed it using Silverlight 4. Now, it's interesting that it's Silverlight 4 because it does mean that you've got a whole lot of capabilities, especially when you're running in out-of-browser mode, to go and talk comm and Office interaction and talk to devices and so on. Very, very cool stuff. And although I've only shown you the desktop host, we could just as easily have hosted this in a browser. Of course, we would have lost our comm and our desktop, our hardware interaction. But all that stuff is just as easy to do. It just deploys a ZAP file instead. I will show you that tomorrow in our session. The other couple of things we've done is we've created a middle tier, a very sophisticated middle tier that runs on an application server somewhere. In fact, in this particular case, we've compressed our application server and our client tier together to make it, if you like, a two-tier application. They both happen to be running on this box here. And the middle tier has got this submit pipeline as a really important part of it. Whenever I put data into the pipeline, I get a hook into to do things as it goes through the process. I can validate it, I can reject it, I can update it, I can kick off workflows, I can do anything I want to do. Anything I can do in .NET, I can do in this submit pipeline. There's a whole bunch of queries that happen, and I'll talk a bit more about queries in a sec. Queries happen behind the scenes. You didn't see them at this stage. I didn't point them out. But every screen that we created actually has a query behind it. Yeah. So we'll talk about those. Again, we have a data workspace at each level. We have a collation of all the data that's being passed around in the data workspace. Again, it talks through WCF RIA services. Uses ASP.NET 4.0 to do the intermediary stuff. And then behind the scenes, at the bottom end, if you like, it's using IIS to do its application tier bits. And at the back end, we have different data sources. Now, in our particular case, we've only used SQL Server. We've used an enterprise SQL Server living somewhere else out in the enterprise, and we used our local version, SQL Express, that the end user developer doesn't know is SQL Express, but don't tell them. We've done a bunch of stuff. We could also just as easily have pushed it up to SQL Azure, and I'll show you that tomorrow as well. We could have taken data from a SharePoint list natively. We could have just said any one of those lookups that we did could be straight out of a SharePoint list. Very, very straightforward to do. And other is pretty much anything else. Anything you can wrap in a WCF RIA service, anything at all, you can now expose as a standard first-class data source to LightSwitch. And this is very important. I'm going to show, if we get time tomorrow, I'll show you a WCF Rea service in action as well, because it means that anything that you do at the back end in terms of exposing your data in the enterprise, or anything you do at the back end in terms of grabbing data from someone else off the cloud, you can now make available to an end user developer as another data source that looks to them exactly like all the others I showed you today. They say add data source and they can set relationships and do a whole bunch of metadata thing and validation and all that kind of stuff, compute properties and all that sort of stuff. Very, very neat stuff. I said stuff enough. So, talked about entities. Entities can be a lot of things. SQL, Azure, SharePoint, Rea services. We've got those custom business types we talked about. Either the ones that ship out of the box or ones you build yourself. Did you see what I did there? Ones you ship out of the box or ones you build yourself. Okay. If you have to explain the graphic twice, it didn't work. But this is really, really important stuff. This is the place where, as a professional developer, you're really going to shine with LightSwitch, because you're going to be able to give your end users these custom types. The ones I showed you with things like email and phone number, they're standard sorts of things. But if you have a particular business type in your organization, I don't know, purchase order number or customer ID that has a bunch of rules around it, you can encapsulate those rules in a business type and give them to your end user developers, so when they create a new database, it just says, this is a purchase order number. And all of that stuff around how do you get it, how do you validate it, how long should it be, all that sort of thing is built in for them. They don't have to worry about it. And you don't have to worry about it either, because you know that they're using the right type to put into the system. If I were you, I'd probably still worry about it, but you know. We did calculated properties. I showed you how to create that set of different property types. We talked about relationships. The cool thing about relationships is you can set relationships between local data really easily, and all that's taken care of for you. You can set relationships between your local data and what we call external data. Yeah? And even cooler to some extent, you can set relationships between external data and external data in your model. Very, very neat stuff. So I could be using SharePoint and SQL Azure. LightSwitch is just the intermediary that allows me to stitch all that stuff together. Validation we've talked about. You can validate with lengths and so on, but you can also just do custom validation with things like this, where you might validate date of birth, or you might validate across the entire entity, where either you need to have the date of birth or the age. We talked about that before. Really straightforward to do. The screens that we have built in are phenomenally good at the 80% use case. You guys get to write the other 80%, right? Yeah. But the new search details, editable grid, list and details are the sort of screens that everyone needs. Everybody needs those screens. Right. Does it have TFS integration? Yes. Thank you. Sorry, throw me another soft one. Oh. Thank you. We'll talk about that later on. We can modify those screens as developer at design time and runtime. There's a whole bunch of auto-generated screens that happen. If you haven't bothered generating a detailed screen, it'll do it for you automatically. Hooray! I do want to point this out though. This is not something where we're actually generating XAML that you then get to go and play with. Yeah? What's happening behind the scenes is a whole bunch of XAML-like stuff being generated, but we don't make any promises that it's going to stay the same. Okay, so tomorrow at the advanced LightSwitch session, I will show you what this stuff looks like behind the scenes in terms of the project structure and how cool it is as a professional developer to take this stuff in and play with it and manipulate it. But you can add UI elements, you can add a whole bunch of stuff, but you can't change the base XAML, yeah, as a developer. This is very, very model driven as opposed to code or XAML driven. And screens are always based on queries. We'll have a look at that next. Queries are interesting because LightSwitch automatically creates queries behind the scenes. Yeah? And we have different types of queries where a collection queries, sort of select stars, or detail queries, just select from, where. The other neat thing is the queries you've got, you can easily add on to. Because the queries are essentially a link statement, it's very simple to get that link statement passed to you by reference, update the link statement, and have that new statement execute. Yeah? It's very easy to create new queries as well. And look, let's get into this and have a look. All right. So I'm going to go back over to LightSwitch, and in the products entity, I'm going to add a query. And for this particular query, let's call it sorted products. Now the query designer at its very basic level just says, I can add a sort property, sort by product name, ascending. Cool. There's a whole bunch of other things I can do in here, by the way. I've got a whole lot of hooks in here when the pre-processed query we'll talk about later on. But if the execute failed, I can do some catching of that detail here. When it's executed, I get into that. Before it executes, I can get access to it there. And there's an access control method called canExecute, which basically returns a boolean and says, has this user got the rights to run this query? Yeah, very, very cool stuff. All right. I'm going to save this. Let's go into the patient detail screen now. And what I really want to do is I want to change, if I add the data item, and I add a query, and this is the sorted products query, okay. What I really want to do is I want the product lookup list to be based on a sorted query rather than the non-sorted query. Okay, so down here at our products, where are we? At the bottom of the content tree, select product autocomplete. It's going to add sorted products. Okay. So now I've got a sorted product list I can choose from here as well. All right. I can do a bunch of other things as well. So let me go over here. I'm going to create a new query based on another query. And I'll show you a little bit more in terms of add query. And this is going to be a products by category query. So I want to get all lists of a product in a particular category. Now, this source here. Oh, I've done here. Done something up. Sorry, I'll just close that. No. I'm going to add. Delete that. I've just missed. Okay. Add query. There we go. Products by category. And that's going to be based on the sorted products query. Actually, no, we can sort it from here. We'll do it from here. Product name ascending. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write some code that allows me to do some filtering. So I'm going to add a query element, which is a parameter. And what I need to do next is very quickly add some details to the screen. So add some details to the category. You know what? That's going to take a little bit longer. There's a couple of things I want to get to next. So basically what I will have done here, I'm not going to show it to you. What I will have done here is added this parameter. I will have automatically added to the screen the ability to pass a parameter in or to accept one as a text box. And then that will allow me to filter searches based on a particular parameter, and that'll return stuff to me automatically. So that's very straightforward to do too. I can base it on other queries. So let's quickly duck back out of here. And the only other thing I perhaps wanted to do here is show you that in this pre-processed query dialog here is I can add I can take the query that's been passed to me as a link object and add stuff to it. So I can just say from the query that's been passed to me where where the category type is this, etc. And all that stuff can happen there automatically. All right. Let's quickly duck back into this and have a quick talk about access control. One of the questions I often get asked here is, that's all very well, but how do I go about getting this stuff into the hands of users so they can't kill themselves or other people? How do I protect them from themselves? How do I make sure that they can get only to the things they need to get to? LightSwitch has got a very robust access control architecture built into it. And you can use Windows or forms-based authentication. If you use forms-based, it's just using the ASP.NET permissions provider. Yeah? So anything that the ASP.NET providers can do, you can do in LightSwitch. And then at the access control level, the developer designates the permissions that can be obtained or not obtained, and then the administrator defines who the users are, what the roles are, and what the permissions are by role, and what the users are by role. And so that's all mangled together at runtime, and we have it's very simple for the developer to check whether the current user has these permissions. So the administrator says this person is in the let's call it the patient administration role. Patient administrators have permissions, can update patient, can read patient, can delete patient. And then at runtime, it's very simple for the program to say, does the current user have the can update patient property role? All right, I'll quickly duck into access control. I'll show you how easy that is to do. I won't build one, but I'll show it to you. Alt Shift Enter. Because in the properties dialog for the application, what we get here is an access control tab, and it says how is access control defined, either with Windows or forms authentication, and then what permissions are there? Can update patient might be a permission. Is allowed to update the patient, and so on, and a description. So I can put a bunch of those in there, and then at runtime, at design time, in the code, I can say demand permission and whatever that permission is. And if that fails, then I get then I can return a false or whatever. Now, interestingly, wherever I have got screen display access control, I can go and check permissions. Wherever I have got data access, that stuff is called automatically, and I can put the data access code in the permission demand code in the data access backend, so that gets enforced no matter where it's called from. So we can say you must be a member of the you must have this permission to do updates of the patient table. So in the can update for that particular entity, I do a check for that permission, and if that returns false, LightSwitch is smart enough to make all of the controls read-only on any screen it displays. LightSwitch is smart enough to, behind the scenes, doesn't matter how data gets into its service, to check that permission is available before it tries to update the back end. So it does that checking it at multiple layers. And so all that stuff which you'd normally have to write yourself is built into the system. All right. I want to quickly talk about the deployment types. Tomorrow we'll go into more detail about deployment, and I'll show you how to deploy including a bunch of different places, including onto Azure, how easy it is to deploy to Windows Azure. But what we created just now is a two-tier desktop app, where our logic and our UI live on the client and our data lives somewhere else. We could also have created a three-tier desktop app where we deployed the business logic onto an IIS service somewhere, yeah, and had the data at the back end, but still run the desktop client as a out-of-browser application. Just as easily, we could have deployed a three-tier web application, which uses Silverlight in browser mode, so you can deploy it not only to a Windows device, but also to a bunch of other OSs and browsers. So we've got a number of different options in that case, and it's all very simple to deploy. And in fact, the deployment is so simple that it looks a bit like right-click, publish, and then there's a wizard that takes you through. Is this a desktop or a web application? Is it a, and then where do the application services live, locally or on an IS server on Windows Azure? That's how straightforward it is. Where should the publishing output go? Do you want to deploy directly to the database now, or do you want to generate scripts? What are the connections you're going to use to connect to the database? We try and enforce some smarts by saying we know that as an administrator you've got access to the database, otherwise you wouldn't be able to create stuff, but what should the application deploy as? And if you don't already have a database login, we've got a button there that walks the user through creating one. We try and enforce that. We try and encourage those best practices as much as possible. How should authentication happen? What are the prerequisites that are part of this deployment? Do we only need the things that the standard things, or are there other services that might need to be running as part of this deploy? This is the click once stuff you've seen before. What other connections? When we're connecting to other stuff, remember we have external data sources. So where do they come from? What certificate should we use to sign it, if anything? And there's a summary of what it is. And then we click publish and away it goes. And tomorrow we'll actually do one of those out up to Azure, and I'll show you how easy that is to do there, and we'll do a couple of other places too. But I did want to point out, in case you weren't going to be here tomorrow, that that's easy to do. All right. So, remember what we said end user developers were looking for. They really want a smooth on-ramp to development. And I hope you'll agree, with the very limited time we've had today, I've been able to show you how easy it is to develop a very full-featured application. It doesn't look pretty yet. If you come tomorrow, I'll show you how to pretty it up. But it is very, very functional. Yeah, it'll do the things you want it to do straight away. The plumbing that's built in is phenomenal in terms of its capabilities, all the things like dirty checking, all the things like access control, and those sorts of things. And it really is very simple to deploy, and you've got lots of flexibility about where it goes. You can imagine let's say the Karatha branch of some manufacturing company has got an issue with their inventory control. They write a little LightSwitch app that does inventory control, and all of a sudden they've increased their inventory efficiency by 37.25%. They're the toast of the entire organisation. And now not only do they want not only does the head office want the Karatha app deployed at Karatha, they want the inventory app across the entire country, 327 different places to deploy the app. That would be almost impossible to do, right? As if we'd gone down the traditional route of the old end user developer. What we can do now, though, is we can easily take that in-house and move the local SQL data source that's sitting on a desktop somewhere in Karatha up into our enterprise data center or up to Windows Azure. We can very simply deploy those applications through click once or through a Zap model as a web application. And all of a sudden, everyone can start using, all 327 branches can start using this inventory application. And of course, the manager of Karatha will get a promotion, and the guy developer will get at least $500 bonus this year. Or a t-shirt, that's right. So really, this is the simplest way to create desktop applications for the desktop and business applications for the desktop and the cloud. There's one URL I want you to remember. There's a bunch of URLs in this slide deck which you'll be able to download later on, but there's one URL I want you to remember, msdn.com/lightswitch. msdn.com/lightswitch. That will link you to pretty much everything else I've shown you here. If you need to get in touch with me, andrew.coates@microsoft.com. I'll be on the stand. Brian, I'll get to that in a sec. I'm coming to that, thank you. There's my blog's there. I tweet occasionally. If you want to get cool stuff, if you want to go to the booth and get a LightSwitch trial installed, then we've got 50-odd USB keys. You don't get to keep the USB key, but we do have the stuff ready for you to install. And if you do that, they'll give you a t-shirt. Not one as cool as this, but a t-shirt nonetheless. If you want to get a hoodie, then I think there's about 10 of those up for grabs. You just need to tweet that URL about where to download the LightSwitch trial, because we really want to use this Twitter thing. Not sure why yet. Did you have 10 hoodies? Yeah, 10. I know you're saying 40, but there's actually 10 from this session. While stocks last, and we're going to try and make them last a little bit. Other stuff that's going on tomorrow at 3:30 in meeting room 7. I'm not sure how we're going to fit everyone in there, but that's where it'll be. Beyond the basics, we're going to talk lots more about the extension story. We're going to talk far more about how to take Silverlight controls and make things really shine. There's some nice stuff we can do around mapping, all kinds of cool stuff, and a bit of deployment. And in the developer area, in the expo hall at 12:30 today, I'll be doing a sort of an intro demo. If you want to, if there's someone who's missed stuff, or if you want to come and look at stuff closer, then please do that. Tomorrow as well, I'll be doing things, and Friday. And if you need a tech quest, if you haven't yet got the Coast to Coates badge in your tech quest, then you might want to come and see me. I've got that tag here, and there's a bunch of other tags you can get as well around LightSwitch, but the Coast to Coates one is there. I haven't got a lot of time for Q&A. I will take questions up here, but we'll say goodbye first. Don't forget to fill in your evals. Please do that. It makes a big difference to us as organisers and speakers getting feedback. And thank you very much. I hope you really enjoy LightSwitch.